You ever wonder how life has a funny way of surprising you? When you're not looking for anything, but somehow, something or someone shows up and changes everything. Out in a little town, where folks still wave to each other on Main Street, there's a man, a mechanic. He doesn't have much, but he's got 2 strong hands, a big heart, and a knack for fixing things most folks would have given up on. One day, a woman pulls up in a classic Eldorado, beautiful car, but even more mysterious is the woman behind the wheel. What he doesn't know? She's not just passing through. She's a billionaire hiding her name, looking for something she's never found in boardrooms or big cities. What happens when kindness meets secrets and 2 lives quietly change forever? Stick around. Because this isn't just a story about cars or money. It's about trust, love, and the small, unexpected ways life gives you exactly what you need. If stories like this warm your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more tales about good people, second chances, and the power of simple, honest living. Now, let's get to it. Here's a kind mechanic fixes her Eldorado. Unaware, she's a secret billionaire looking for an honest man. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cracked pavement of Rockford's Main Street. Dust swirled lazily in the air, kicked up by the occasional passing pickup. It was the kind of small-town quiet that felt stitched together by years of familiarity, where everyone knew whose porch light stayed on late and whose dog had wandered off again. Silas Mercer stood in front of his garage, wiping the grease from his calloused hands with an old red rag. The sign above him, Mercer's Auto Repair, Esther 1952, creaked gently in the breeze. Behind him, the sounds of the shop hummed, the low whir of an engine belt being replaced, the clink of tools against metal, the muffled laughter of his daughter, Clara and old Mr. Prescott arguing over carburetor specs. That's when he heard it, a low, smooth rumble, unmistakable to anyone who knew cars, the sound of an engine built not just for driving, but for gliding. His eyes narrowed instinctively, focusing down the street. A long, sleek silhouette appeared, sunlight bouncing off its curved hood. A 1960 Cadillac Eldorado. Silas recognized it instantly, not just because of its distinct tail fins or its shimmering rose-colored paint, but because cars like that didn't just roll into Rockford unannounced. They belonged to another time, another place, somewhere glossier, faster, richer. The Eldorado slowed and coughed slightly before rolling to an awkward stop right in front of his shop. A puff of smoke curled from the hood. He raised an eyebrow. "Well, aren't you a long way from the showroom?" he muttered under his breath. The driver's door creaked open. A woman stepped out, adjusting her sunglasses with deliberate ease. She wore a faded denim jacket, hair pulled back under a scarf. Something about her posture, controlled, composed, felt practiced. Silas guessed she wasn't used to towns like Rockford, but she wore the small-town disguise well. "Afternoon," he called, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "Trouble?" She gave a polite smile, but her eyes flickered warily. "Seems she's sputtering a bit," she replied, resting a hand on the Eldorado's door like she was steadying both herself and the car. Didn't expect her to give out, in the middle of nowhere. Silas approached, nodding as he listened. Even without popping the hood, he could already tell. The timing chain had slipped, maybe a transmission issue too. But he didn't rush. Good mechanics never rushed, and neither did honest men. "Name's Silas Mercer. This is Mercer's Auto." He gestured behind him. "I can take a look." "Appreciate it," she replied, offering her hand. Rowena shook it firmly. No rings, no flashy watch, no telltale signs of someone accustomed to people knowing her name before she said it. But something about the way she spoke, polite but measured, told him she was used to keeping things guarded. Silas popped the hood, peering inside like a surgeon sizing up a patient. He ran his fingers gently over the engine, his brow furrowing in concentration. "You've kept her in good shape," he remarked casually. "Most folks don't appreciate how finicky these old Cadillacs can be, She's not just a car, she's got personality. Rowena gave a small, almost involuntary smile. She belonged to my father. I've kept her running since he passed. There was something soft in the way she said it. Not sorrow exactly, more like reverence. Silas nodded silently, respecting the unspoken weight of it. Well, Miss Rowena, she's fixable. Needs a part I'll have to order. Might take a couple days. She hesitated. Couple days? Silas caught the faintest flicker of uncertainty in her voice. People passing through usually didn't expect to stay long in Rockford. There's a diner down the street, he offered. Motel's clean, nothing fancy. Folks around here keep to themselves, but they're good people. Rowena gave a tight nod, clearly weighing her options. Silas wiped his hands again and added, You're welcome to leave her here overnight. I'll give her a good once-over. She glanced back at the Eldorado, then at Silas. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding. That wasn't about cars at all. It was about trust, about knowing who to treat your prized possession, or perhaps your heart, with care. All right, she agreed softly. I'll stay. Silas gave a small nod and stepped aside as she gathered, a small bag from the back seat. As she walked toward the motel, her steps were steady, but her gaze lingered briefly on the town. The rusted signs, the crooked lampposts, the quiet rhythm of a place untouched by the chaos of elsewhere. Silas watched her go, the late afternoon, light casting long shadows across the road once more. He glanced back at the Eldorado, running his hand gently along the curve of the hood. Let's see what secrets you're hiding, sweetheart, he murmured to the car. But a part of him wondered if he was talking about more than just the engine. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Silas unlocked the front door of Mercer's Auto the next morning. The scent of oil and old leather mingled in the air, a smell as familiar to him as the creak of the shop's wooden floorboards beneath. His boots. He moved methodically like always. Coffee brewed in the corner. Tools neatly arranged, wiped down from the day before. The small radio on the workbench flickered on, playing a tune older than both him and the garage itself. But his mind wasn't on the radio. It lingered on the Eldorado parked just outside, and more specifically, the woman who'd arrived with it. Rowena. There was something about her, something poised yet watchful, like she'd walked through the world wearing armor for too long. She didn't belong here, that much was clear. Yet she hadn't flinched at the quiet or the dust or the stillness of Rockford. That intrigued him more than he cared to admit. He pulled open the garage bay door, letting the crisp morning air sweep inside. The Eldorado gleamed faintly in the light, despite its age. Silas ran a hand along the fender, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. She's something special, ain't she? A voice called from behind. Silas glanced up to see old Mr. Prescott hobbling in, cane tapping rhythmically. The man had been hanging around Mercer's Auto for longer than Silas had worked here, offering unsolicited advice, sipping black coffee, and occasionally helping tune carburetors when the mood struck. Beautiful piece of machinery, Prescott continued, whistling low. Don't see many like her anymore. Silas nodded. Engine's solid, but the transmission's touchy. Needs parts I ordered yesterday. Might take a few days. Prescott peered at him over his glasses. That the lady's car? Silas didn't answer immediately, tightening a bolt on the workbench instead. Finally, he shrugged. She's passing through. Prescott grinned knowingly, tapping his cane. Seems like everyone's passing through till they find something worth staying for. Silas didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he focused on the Eldorado's engine, his hands steady, his mind drifting. Later that afternoon, Rowena appeared, her scarf tucked neatly beneath her chin, eyes shielded by those same dark sunglasses. She stood at the garage entrance, one hand resting on the strap of her leather satchel, the other hovering slightly, like she wasn't sure if she should step further in. Silas straightened, wiping his hands on his rag. "You looking to check in on her?" He gestured toward the Eldorado. Rowena smiled faintly. "Just curious how she's doing." "She'll pull through. Needs a few days." She hesitated, then walked inside, the faint scent of motor oil and steel wrapping around her. Her eyes flicked across the shop, lingering on the walls lined with black and white photographs of cars and family, snapshots of another era. "Been here long?" she asked, voice casual. Silas leaned against the workbench. "Garage has been here since my granddad opened it. After him, my father, then me." Rowena nodded, lips pursing thoughtfully. 3 generations. That's rare. Silas offered a half-smile. "Things don't change fast in Rockford." She glanced at one of the photos, a young boy standing beside a bright red '57 Chevy, smiling awkwardly. "Is that you?" she asked softly. He chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, first car I ever worked on." Rowena traced her gaze back to him. "You stayed. Most people don't." Silas met her eyes, steady and quiet. "I guess some places grow roots deep." There was a pause, a comfortable kind, like neither of them felt the need to fill it with empty words. Finally, Rowena spoke, her voice softer. "My father used to talk about cars like they were alive. He said they remember you if you treat them right." Silas nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He wasn't wrong. They stood there for a long moment, the hum of the radio in the background, the world outside moving at its own slow pace. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the familiar buzz of conversation floated down Main Street. It was the 3rd Thursday of the month, Garage Day. Once a month, Silas opened his doors not just for business, but for the town. Folks who couldn't afford repairs came by. People brought covered dishes. Kids ran around the lot while neighbors shared stories over folding chairs and pie tins. By twilight, the lot outside Mercer's Auto glowed with strings of warm lights hung from lampposts and garage beams. Laughter mingled with the scent of grilled food and gasoline. Silas flipped burgers behind a small grill, glancing occasionally toward Clara, who was teaching a group of kids how to check oil levels under an old pickup's hood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Rowena. She stood near the garage entrance, observing quietly, unsure if she should intrude. Silas wiped his hands on his apron and walked toward her. "Hungry?" he asked simply, gesturing to the tables. Rowena hesitated, then smiled, something unguarded slipping through. "It's not what I expected." Silas chuckled. "That's Rockford for you." He led her toward the food, introducing her casually to a few of the town's regulars, Mrs. Langley from the post office, Earl the retired fire chief, a handful of others who nodded politely but didn't pry. It was the kind of gathering that required no pretense, where no one cared who you were, only how you treated others. As the evening wore on, Rowena found herself seated next to Clara, who was animatedly explaining the difference between drum brakes and disc brakes, her eyes lighting up. Rowena laughed, softly, something unfamiliar fluttering in her chest, a warmth she hadn't realized she'd missed. Across the lot, Silas caught her gaze and gave a small nod, like he'd known all along that sometimes, the simplest things, good food, honest, conversation, shared moments, were enough to make people feel they belonged. The motel room was quiet that night. Too quiet. Rowena lay on her back, staring at the speckled ceiling fan lazily turning above her. Outside, she could hear the soft chorus of crickets and the occasional hum of a car passing down Main Street, its headlights briefly slicing across the window blinds. The smells from the garage barbecue still lingered faintly in her clothes. Smoke, motor oil, the sweetness of someone's homemade apple pie. But her mind wasn't on the evening. It was back decades ago, in a different garage. She could still see her father's hands, long fingers stained with grease, guiding hers as they rebuilt the carburetor of his prized Eldorado. She remembered how his voice softened when he spoke. About engines, like each piece of machinery had a story worth telling. "A good mechanic doesn't just fix things, Ro," he used to say, wiping sweat from his brow. "He listens. Every sound, every vibration tells you something if you're patient. Enough." Her father had believed in patience. In listening, Rowena swallowed hard, rolling to her side, trying to push the memory away. But tonight it clung stubbornly. The next morning dawned pale and cool. Fog still clung low over the edges of Rockford, softening the town's sharp corners. Rowena stood outside Mercer's auto, coffee in hand, watching as Silas opened up shop, moving with practiced ease. She liked how everything about him was unhurried, deliberate. He never seemed to fill silences. Needlessly, never demanded more of people than they were willing to give. It reminded her too much of how different her world usually was. Fast, noisy, transactional. She cleared her throat lightly. "Morning." Silas looked up from unlocking the tool chest, gave her a small nod. "Morning." There was comfort in how little he asked. No intrusive questions, no polite curiosity about why she was still lingering in a town like Rockford. She walked over to the Eldorado, running her fingers lightly across its curved hood. "She's been through a lot," Rowena murmured half to herself. Silas glanced at her but said nothing, crouching beside the front wheel to check the brakes. A moment passed before she spoke again. "My father taught me how to rebuild her when I was 16, she said, voice quieter now. "We spent months working on her after school. He didn't want her sitting idle, rusting away." Silas straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "He sounds like a man who knew a thing or two about engines." Rowena smiled faintly, but there was something heavy in it. He did. More importantly, he knew when to walk away from everything else and just be. She shook her head slightly, almost as if embarrassed by her own words. Silas didn't press, but instead leaned against the car, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. "My dad was the same," he offered, voice low. "Spent hours with me in this garage, explaining things twice, 3 times over, until I understood not just the how, but the why." Rowena met his gaze. There was something quietly grounding about Silas Mercer, like he belonged to another time, a time before people spoke only to fill silence. Later that afternoon, Clara showed up at the garage, her backpack slung haphazardly over one shoulder, grease already smudged on her cheek. She gave her father a quick wave before heading toward the back to sort through spare parts. Rowena watched, amused, as Clara balanced a heavy socket wrench in one hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She's good," Rowena commented. Silas smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "She's stubborn, takes after her mother." There was something in his voice then, soft, tinged with a tenderness Rowena hadn't noticed before. "She's lucky," Rowena said quietly. Silas glanced at her, a question in his eyes, but Rowena shook her head gently, offering no explanation. By early evening, the garage settled into its usual rhythm. Occasional customers stopping by. Small town? Conversations exchanged over the hood of a pickup, the smell of coffee drifting from the back office. Rowena lingered by the workbench, thumbing absent-mindedly through a worn-out service manual. She wasn't sure why she kept finding herself drawn here. Maybe it was easier than sitting alone in that too-quiet motel room. Maybe she liked how predictable everything felt in this space. "You're welcome to stay." Silas's voice broke gently through her thoughts. Rowena looked up. "I don't mind," he continued, wiping down a carburetor. "Some folks like the noise of engines better than silence." She smiled, really smiled this time. "Yeah," she murmured, voice soft. "I do." As dusk settled, she finally made her way back toward the motel, the cool air brushing against her skin. The sky glowed faintly pink, and the town seemed even quieter now, save for the distant creak of porch swings and a dog barking 2 blocks over. Rowena paused before crossing the street, glancing back toward Mercer's auto. Inside that unassuming garage, amidst grease stains and the hum of radio static, she felt something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Something patient, something steady, something that, like her father's voice years ago, seemed to say, "You can stop running now." By the time Thursday afternoon rolled around, Rockford's quiet streets hummed with a different kind of energy. It was subtle, barely noticeable if you weren't looking, but it was there. Children racing past on bicycles, women carrying trays covered with foil, and the occasional dog trotting behind, hoping for scraps. Rowena stood at the window of her motel room, watching as the town seemed to gravitate toward one place, the same garage she'd spent much of the past few days lingering in, Mercer's auto. She'd heard one of the motel clerks mention it in passing that morning, how every third Thursday folks gathered there. No appointments, no bills exchanged, no formal invitations. Just an unspoken agreement that Silas Mercer's garage belonged to the town, and for one night each month it became its living room. Rowena found herself slipping on her jacket almost without thinking. When she arrived, the transformation was remarkable. Gone was the usual stillness of the garage. Instead, strings of warm lights hung from the beams, casting soft pools of gold across the cracked pavement. Tables were set up with mismatched chairs, platters of food spread out like a family reunion. Old country tunes drifted faintly from a vintage radio propped on a workbench, and there, at the heart of it all, was Silas, apron tied at his waist, flipping burgers at a small grill, his movements as steady and unhurried as always. Clara zipped past her, carrying a tray of sodas. A few local kids clustered around an old pickup, poking at its hood, while one of the older men, Mr. Prescott, she recognized, gave a running commentary. Rowena hesitated at the edge, unsure if she belonged in a scene that felt so seamlessly woven together. But before she could retreat, Silas spotted her. He gave a slight nod, as if expecting her all along. "You made it," he said simply, setting down the spatula. She shrugged lightly, stuffing her hands in her jacket pockets. Curiosity got the better of me. He offered that small smile she was starting to recognize. Not wide, not showy, but genuine. "Come on," he gestured toward the tables. "Plenty to go around." Rowena moved through the crowd cautiously, nodding politely as Clara introduced her to Mrs. Langley from the post office and Earl, the retired fire chief. No one asked where she was from. No one pried about why she was staying longer than planned. Instead, they handed her a plate, poured her sweet tea, and treated her like she'd always been there. There was something disarming about it. She wasn't used to being seen and not sized up. As dusk deepened, lanterns flickered to life. Conversations ebbed and flowed, stories swapped, jokes shared. Rowena found herself seated on a folding chair, plate balanced in her lap, watching the easy rhythm of it all. Silas sat across from her, arms crossed, eyes quietly scanning the gathering, like someone taking stock, not because he needed to, but because he cared. "How long have you been doing this?" Rowena asked, nodding toward the crowd. He glanced at her, shrugging slightly. "Started after Clara's mom passed. Folks around here, they needed something. And maybe so did I." Rowena's gaze softened. "It's rare," she murmured. "A place where everyone shows up without needing a reason." Silas met her eyes, steadily. "Sometimes people just need to know they've got a place to land." Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Later, as the food dwindled and chairs scraped gently against pavement, Clara tugged at Rowena's sleeve. "Want to see something?" she asked eagerly. Rowena followed her to the back of the garage where the noise faded slightly. Clara crouched beside a dusty shelf, pulling out an old battered photo album. "My dad keeps this back here," Clara explained, flipping it open. "Pictures from when Grandpa ran the shop." Rowena leaned in, smiling at black and white snapshots of smiling faces, rusted-out trucks, families gathered around the same garage decades earlier. "This place has always been the same," Clara said matter-of-factly. "People come, people go, but the garage stays." Rowena swallowed hard. It wasn't about the cars, she realized. It was about what they built around them. A community that didn't just fix engines, but hearts, too. As the night wound down, Silas began quietly packing up, folding chairs, wiping tables. Rowena moved instinctively to help, gathering empty plates and stacking cups. They worked in companionable silence, the last strings of light swaying gently overhead. Finally, as he wound up the extension cord, Silas glanced at her. "You planning to head out soon?" he asked casually. Rowena hesitated, gripping the stack of plates a little tighter. "Haven't decided." He nodded, not pushing. Just waiting, like he did with everything else. And maybe that's why, before she even realized she'd spoken, she added softly, "There's nothing much waiting for me wherever I go." It slipped out like a truth she'd been holding in too long. Silas didn't flinch, didn't ask for more. Instead, he simply said, "Well, there's always a seat open. Here. Simple. Steady. No conditions attached." Rowena felt something shift quietly inside her. Later, as she walked back toward the motel, the night air cool against her skin, she thought about how strange it was to find herself here, tethered, if only, slightly to a town she never intended to stop in. Maybe it wasn't so strange after all. Some engines, after all, ran smoother when you finally let them idle. The sky darkened quicker than usual the next afternoon, clouds rolling over Rockford like heavy wool blankets. Rowena stood outside the motel, her hands tucked deep into her jacket pockets, eyes scanning the horizon. The air carried that familiar scent, earthy, metallic, electric, the kind of scent that told you rain was coming, whether you were ready or not. She glanced down Main Street, catching sight of Mercer's auto, the garage door half open despite the thickening clouds. She didn't know why, but something about the place tugged at her, like a thread she couldn't stop unraveling. Inside, Silas worked steadily, sleeves rolled up, focus sharp as he leaned over the Eldorado's engine. The part he'd been waiting on had finally arrived that morning. Still, there was no rush in his movements. Every bolt tightened with care, every sound from the car telling him its story. Rowena lingered by the doorway, quietly watching. "You're going to beat the rain?" she asked softly. Silas glanced up, giving a faint smile. "That's the plan." He wiped his hands on a rag, then nodded toward the sky. Storms rolling in faster than expected. She stepped further inside, the smell of grease, metal, and something warmer, something familiar, wrapping around her like a worn-in jacket. Storms always catch you by surprise in places like this, she murmured almost to herself. Silas gave her a sidelong glance. "You sound like you've weathered a few." Rowena smiled faintly but didn't elaborate. It wasn't long before the rain arrived. Sharp, sudden sheets pounding against the tin roof of the garage. The sound filled every inch of the space, a steady drumming rhythm that made conversation. Quieter, more intimate. Silas checked the windows, ensuring everything was sealed. A few drops leaked through the corner seams. He grabbed an old towel, tucking it under. Rowena watched as he worked, how he moved without fuss, how nothing seemed to rattle him. The world could pour down around him, and he'd still keep steady. "I don't think I've stayed in one place this long in years," she admitted suddenly, surprising herself. Silas didn't look up from adjusting the wrench. "That a bad thing?" Rowena shook her head. "No, just unfamiliar." She leaned back against the workbench, arms folded loosely. "Most people," she continued, her voice quieter now, "they're always chasing the next thing. Bigger deals, faster cars, fancier cities." Her gaze drifted toward the Eldorados, sleek lines, droplets pattering gently across its hood. My life's been a lot like that, she added. Fast lanes, boardrooms, people who smile at you but never see you. Silas finally glanced up, wiping his hands again. His eyes were calm, steady, as always. And now? He asked simply. Rowena exhaled slowly, the words heavy in her chest. Now, I'm not sure what I'm chasing. The rain kept on, relentless, washing the town in a hazy gray. A knock echoed faintly from the side door. Silas moved to open it, revealing Earl, the retired fire chief, drenched but grinning, his old raincoat, clinging to him. Silas, Earl huffed, wiping water from his brow. Roof's leaking bad over at Langley's. Think you could help patch it? Silas nodded without hesitation. Let me grab my tools. Rowena stepped back, unsure if she should excuse herself, but before she could speak, Silas turned toward her. You're welcome to wait here till it lets up, he offered, voice casual. She hesitated, then nodded. Silas disappeared into the rain, Earl following, and Rowena stood in the silence that remained, broken only by the steady percussion of water, on 10 minutes stretched into an hour. The radio hummed low in the background, the smell of motor oil grounding her. Finally, unable to sit still, Rowena walked to the back office, peeking at the cluttered shelves. Old photographs, yellowed notebooks, handwritten invoices from decades past. It felt like a time capsule, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond Rockford. Her fingers brushed against a small-framed picture. Silas, as a boy, sitting proudly beside a rusted-out Chevy, his father's hand resting on his shoulder. A soft smile tugged at her lips before she set it back. By the time Silas returned, rain still drumming outside, his jacket was soaked through, boots caked with mud. But his expression hadn't changed. Calm, unwavering. Roof's patched for now, he said, hanging his coat by the door. Rowena met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. You didn't have to go out in that, she murmured. Silas shrugged lightly. Sometimes folks just need help, rain or shine. There was no pretense in his voice, no grand declarations, just quiet certainty. Later, as the storm finally eased and dusk pressed in, Rowena stood by the Eldorado, fingers tracing idle patterns on the hood. Silas, she said softly. He glanced at her, wiping the last of the rain from his hands. You ever think about leaving? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over, resting his palm against the car beside hers. I had offers, he said after a moment. Jobs in bigger towns, shops with better pay. He glanced toward the garage doors, toward the small-town world beyond them. But this place, it's where my roots are. My family, my people. There's something about knowing you're needed, not for what you can buy, but for what you can build. Rowena felt her throat tighten. Maybe it wasn't what he said, but the quiet conviction behind it that made something inside her settle. She gave a small nod, almost to herself. Sounds like you figured out what you're chasing, she murmured. Silas offered a faint smile. Maybe. As she walked back toward the motel under the dripping branches, Rowena realized, for the first time in a long while, the storm outside wasn't the only one that had begun to pass. The morning after the storm was crisp and clear, the world washed clean. Puddles shimmered in the dappled light along Main Street, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the air. Rowena sat at the diner's corner booth, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of her, steam curling lazily. She stirred it absently, watching townsfolk filter in and out. Farmers, postal clerks, high school kids grabbing breakfast before class. Each familiar to one another, each exchanging greetings like threads weaving the fabric of Rockford tighter. No one paid her much mind, and she found herself grateful for it. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. On Mercer's auto. On Silas. On the quiet way he'd weathered the storm, both literal and metaphorical, without complaint. On how unsettlingly steady he was compared to everyone she'd ever known. She almost didn't notice the tall, thin man walking into the diner until he paused near her booth. Rowena. Her name, spoken aloud, clipped and sharp. Her eyes flicked up, recognition flickering before she could mask it. It was Gerald Klein, one of the board members from her company, Blackwood Motors, a man who always wore too tight suits and too wide smiles. His presence here felt jarring, like someone had transplanted a piece of her old world right into Rockford's quiet heart. She straightened slightly, forcing calm. "Gerald," she replied evenly, setting her coffee down. "What brings you here?" He chuckled nervously, glancing around. "I might ask you the same. We've been trying to reach you for weeks. Everyone's asking where you disappeared to." Rowena's jaw tensed. "I needed time," she said coolly. Gerald lowered his voice, leaning in. "You're aware the press is starting to speculate, right? You vanished off the grid, and now there are murmurs about mergers, investors wondering if something's wrong." Rowena's eyes flicked to the window, where the garage stood just a few blocks down. Her heart thudded. "Everything's fine," she said, measured. "Tell them that." Gerald frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Rowena, you can't keep playing hide-and-seek. It's not a good look, for you or the company." Before she could respond, the waitress appeared, coffee pot in hand. Rowena gave a tight smile, nodding politely. When she glanced back at Gerald, her voice had cooled even more. "I'll be back when I'm ready," she said simply. Gerald sighed, frustrated. "At least let me drive you back. You don't belong." He paused, glancing distastefully out the window. "Here." Rowena's fingers curled around her cup. He didn't get it. He'd never understand why she'd chosen to disappear here, in a place where no one cared who she was or what she was worth. And in that moment, she realized how much she didn't want to explain herself. "I have a car," she replied, voice edged. "I'm not going anywhere yet." Gerald hesitated, then stood, clearly irritated but unwilling to press further. "Fine, but the board expects you back soon." He walked out without looking back, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne, and the weight of another life she thought she'd left behind. Rowena didn't head straight back to the motel. Instead, she found herself drifting toward Mercer's auto, her pace slower than usual, her thoughts tangled. Silas was under the hood of the Eldorado when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed, in concentration. He glanced up at her approach, offering his usual nod. "Morning." Rowena hesitated, unsure how to frame the weight sitting on her chest. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. He straightened, wiping his hands casually. "You, all right?" he asked, voice calm as ever. For a second she almost said yes, almost defaulted to the easy answer. But something about the way he looked at her, steady, patient, made her stop. "A man from my company came looking for me today," she said, quietly. Silas didn't react, simply leaned back against the workbench, waiting. Rowena swallowed, voice softer now. "He knows who I am." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint hum of the radio and the distant murmur of the town waking up. Finally, Silas spoke, tone even. "I figured as much." She blinked, startled. He gave a small shrug. "You're not like most folks passing through here. The way you talk about engines, the way you look at people, you've seen more of the world than you let on." Rowena felt something catch in her throat. "You never asked," she said, voice almost a whisper. Silas met her eyes, gaze unwavering. "Didn't need to." Her breath hitched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt heavier. Now, not awkward, but charged, like the air before a storm. Finally, Silas exhaled, folding his arms loosely. Does it change anything? He asked softly. Rowena shook her head, a lump forming she couldn't quite swallow. I don't know. And maybe that was the truth she'd been running from. She'd built her entire life on control, on strategy, on knowing exactly how people would react when they found out who she was. But here, in this garage, none of that seemed to matter. Silas gave a small nod as if confirming something he'd already known. You're welcome here, he said quietly. Same as before. Simple. Uncomplicated. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. Later that afternoon, Rowena lingered by the Eldorado, tracing the hood ornament with her fingertips. Clara bounded over, grease-smudged and smiling, Dad says. She'll be ready soon, Clara chirped, gesturing at the car. You'll be back on the road in no time. Rowena smiled faintly, heart twisting. Back on the road. But to where? That night, as she lay awake in the motel room, the rain from yesterday long gone, she stared at the ceiling and wondered. What? If the place she'd been trying to leave all along wasn't the town or the job, but herself. It was nearing sunset when Rowena walked back toward Mercer's auto, the sky brushed in soft hues of orange and lavender. The town had quieted down after the day's bustle, shop windows darkened, porch lights flickering to life, the occasional dog barking in the distance. She slowed her steps as the familiar outline of the garage came into view. Silas was still there, as she expected, the wide bay door open to the cool air. The Eldorado sat front and center, its rose-colored body gleaming under the fading light. Rowena hesitated at the entrance, her hand brushing the edge of the doorway. Silas didn't look up immediately. He was finishing something beneath the hood, movements calm and methodical. It struck her then how he never seemed rushed, never seemed like he had somewhere else to be. For someone like Rowena, who'd spent years with every second accounted for, it was both foreign and magnetic. After a long pause, he straightened, wiping his hands on the familiar rag. She's good to go, he said simply, nodding toward the Eldorado. Rowena swallowed, unsure why her chest felt tight. Thank you, she murmured. He gave a small nod, like that was all that needed to be said. But it wasn't. Not for her. There were words pressing against the back of her throat, things she didn't quite know how to express. So instead, she moved toward the car, trailing her fingers lightly along the hood. I should probably get moving, she said, voice quiet. Silas didn't argue. He didn't remind her she didn't owe anyone here anything. But something in his eyes shifted, like he understood more than he let on. She opened the driver's side door, slipping inside. The leather interior felt familiar, grounding. And there, tucked, neatly on the dashboard, was a folded piece of paper. Her brows knit together as she reached for it, unfolding it carefully. Handwritten. No signature. A good engine hums when it's treated right. People aren't so different. Rowena stared at the words, her heart tightening. She didn't need to ask who'd left it. The drive back to the motel felt slower, her mind heavy with the weight of it all. She parked beneath the dim street lamp, but instead of heading straight inside, she sat in the car, the note still in her hand. For so long, she'd measured people by how they reacted to her name, her title, the size of her bank account. It had become second nature, watching for the shift in their gaze, the calculation behind their smiles. But Silas Mercer hadn't flinched. He'd known, probably from the start. And yet none of it changed how he looked at her, not like a woman to impress or manage, just a person. The thought sent a strange ache through her chest. Later that evening, unable to sleep, she found herself walking. The town was still, bathed in moonlight, shadows stretching long across the empty streets. Without thinking, her steps carried her back to the garage. The bay door was closed, but the lights inside glowed faintly. She hesitated, then knocked lightly on the side entrance. After a moment, it opened. Silas stood there, surprised but not unwelcoming, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Rowena shook her head. They stood, like that for a beat, silence folding comfortably between them. Finally she spoke, voice low. "You left me a note." Silas leaned against the doorframe, wiping his hands on a rag. "Figured it might outlast anything I could say in person," he replied simply. Rowena exhaled slowly, her fingers curling at her sides. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why didn't you ask who I was?" "Why I was here?" Silas met her gaze steadily, like he'd been expecting the question all along. "Because none of that changes what I've seen," he said, voice even. "Someone who loves her car like it's a living thing. Someone who shows up, listens, helps clear tables without being asked. That's enough." Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to being seen that plainly without expectation or angle. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Silas glanced away briefly as if gathering his words. "I lost a lot when my wife passed," he said softly. "Thought maybe if I stayed busy, kept fixing things, it'd fill the space." His eyes flicked back to her. Something gentler there. "But there are some things you can't fix. Some you just sit with till they stop hurting so much." Rowena felt something shift inside her, something unspoken loosening. They stood under, the soft hum of the overhead light, the night wrapping around them. Finally, Silas spoke again, quieter this time. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Rowena." Her name in his voice felt like an anchor, steadying. She swallowed hard, nodding. "Maybe," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "I've been explaining myself too long." Silas gave a faint smile. Nothing showy, just solid. "You're welcome here," he said simply. "For as long as you need. No conditions, no demands." It was, perhaps, the first time in years anyone had said that to her without strings attached. Rowena felt something uncoil in her chest. Relief, maybe, or something quieter, something that felt a lot like peace. She left a little while later, the cool night air crisp against her skin. When she glanced back at the garage, she noticed the lights were still on, the soft glow spilling onto the pavement. And for the first time since arriving in Rockford, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so eager to leave after all. The days in Rockford had a way of blending gently, like brushstrokes on an old canvas. Morning sun spilling over rusted rooftops, evenings cooled by the steady hum of crickets, and everything in between moving at its own quiet pace. Rowena had stayed longer than she'd planned, much longer. She told herself she was waiting on something, on the Eldorado, on a call, on clarity. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. Today, she found herself back at Mercer's Auto without even thinking. It had become her default place, the safe harbor her feet unconsciously sought. Silas was at the workbench when she walked in, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in some intricate repair. He looked up as she entered, offered the same small nod he'd given her a dozen times before. It had started to feel steadying, like an anchor. Rowena crossed the garage, pausing beside the car lift where Clara stood balancing on tiptoe, trying to tighten a bolt. "Need a hand?" Rowena asked lightly. Clara grinned. "Dad's teaching me to rotate tires." Rowena laughed softly. "Sounds like a valuable skill." "Better than any math class," Clara quipped, wiping grease off her cheek with the back of her hand. Silas glanced over at them, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. And for a moment, Rowena let herself imagine, what if this was her normal? A small garage, hands-on work, people who didn't expect anything beyond what she could give freely. Later, when Clara headed off to deliver parts to a neighbor, Rowena lingered near the back of the shop, leaning against the worn wood-paneled wall. Silas worked quietly, focused, but she could feel the unspoken question hanging between them. Finally, she broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving?" It slipped out more bluntly than she intended. But Silas didn't flinch. He sat down, his wrench, wiping his hands before leaning back against the bench. "I did once," he admitted. "A long time ago." Rowena waited, sensing this wasn't something he spoke of often. "My wife, Maggie. She wanted to see more of the world," he continued, voice low but steady. "We talked about moving, starting fresh somewhere new." He paused, gaze distant. But then she got sick. And suddenly this town, the place we thought about leaving, became the only thing holding us together. Rowena felt something tighten in her chest. Silas glanced at her, something softer in his eyes. She passed not long after Clara turned 5. And I stayed. For Clara. For my mom. For the people here who needed a hand. He gave a quiet shrug. Leaving didn't feel like the answer anymore. Rowena swallowed, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Silas shook his head gently. "Everyone carries something," he said. "The trick is not letting it bury you." Rowena stared at the concrete floor, her heart beating painfully slow. She'd spent years trying to outrun what she carried. Expectations, responsibility, loneliness dressed up as success. Now she wondered if maybe she'd been running in circles all along. That evening, as the light dimmed, she found herself helping Silas close up, folding tarps, stacking tools, sweeping dust from corners. It felt grounding, like participating in something honest. When the last bolt was tightened and the bay doors slid shut, they lingered outside, the cool air brushing against them. Silas glanced at her, voice low. "You planning to leave soon?" Rowena hesitated, the question settling heavily between them. She wanted to give an easy answer, something definitive. But the truth felt messier. Instead, she looked up at the fading stars, her arms crossed loosely. "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep thinking I should, but every time I go to pack, something holds me back." Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "No one's in a hurry here," he said quietly. Rowena smiled faintly, heart twisting. She'd spent so much of her life being in a hurry. Maybe she didn't have to anymore. The next morning, Rowena stood outside her motel room, the note Silas had left still folded in her jacket pocket. She unfolded it once more, tracing the familiar handwriting. "A good engine hums when it's treated right. People aren't so different." It wasn't just about the car. She understood that now. It was about her, about how, for so long, she'd let herself rust. But in this small town, in this old garage, she'd felt something shift. Like maybe, just maybe, she didn't need fixing, but a place to idle long enough to remember who she was beneath it all. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from Gerald, no doubt. She ignored it. Instead, she found herself walking back toward Mercer's auto, heart quieter than it had been in years. Silas was outside when she arrived, Clara laughing as she ran circles around an old pickup. Rowena met his gaze across the lot, something unspoken hanging between them. She didn't have to say anything. He already knew, and maybe that's what made it feel like the beginning of something worth staying for. The morning air smelled faintly of autumn, dry leaves, crisp earth, a hint of something changing just beneath the surface. Rowena stood beside the Eldorado, her fingers lightly tracing the curve of the door handle. Silas had done good work. The car purred now, smooth and steady like it hadn't in years. All it would take was turning the key, slipping down Main Street, and disappearing back into the life she'd carefully built for herself. She stared at the dashboard, the familiar hum beneath her feet, and felt nothing she expected. Instead, her chest felt heavy. She glanced toward Mercer's auto, where the garage door was already open. the faint clatter of tools and the hum of a radio drifting out. Silas was inside, moving with his usual quiet rhythm. Clara's laughter echoed faintly from the back lot. Rowena swallowed. There was no grand farewell waiting for her here. No one pressuring her to stay. No demands placed on her shoulders. Just a town that had folded her into its fabric without asking for anything in return. And maybe that was why leaving felt so impossibly hard. She drove slowly down Main Street, the Eldorado gliding like silk beneath her hands. Every storefront felt familiar now. The faded diner sign, the crooked lamp-post, even the stray dog dozing under the hardware store window. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fast, but somehow it had become home. She parked by the post office and sat there a moment longer, watching people go about their day, chatting on sidewalks, waving at passing cars. Nobody glanced twice at her, the woman in the Cadillac. It was freeing and terrifying. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The messages were still there, Gerald's name flashing repeatedly. The board waiting. Investors restless. Her life, orderly and efficient, humming in the background like an engine left running too long. Rowena stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the call button. Then she powered it off. By noon, she found herself back at the garage, leaning casually against one of the workbenches while Clara demonstrated, very proudly, how to change a spark plug. Silas worked beside them, listening quietly, offering corrections without fuss. It struck Rowena again. How easy it was, this rhythm they had, no expectations, no games. After a while, Clara bounded off, leaving Rowena alone with Silas. She cleared her throat lightly, her voice softer now. "The car's ready," she said. Silas nodded, wiping his hands. There was a pause, stretching long between them. Finally, Rowena glanced at him, something tight in her chest. "I should probably be going," she added quietly. Silas met her gaze, steady as always. "Maybe," he said simply. The word hung there, without judgment, without pressure. Rowena swallowed hard, fingers curling lightly around the edge of the bench. "There's a whole life waiting for me out there," she murmured, almost like she was trying to convince herself. Silas nodded again, wiping grease from his palms. "Only question is whether it's the life you want." The words landed gently, without weight, but they felt heavier than anything she'd carried. She stood there for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, she broke the silence. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for fixing the car." She trailed off, unable to find the words to name what he'd done, how he'd offered her something no one else had in years. A place to breathe, a place to simply be. Silas gave a small nod, no flourish, no grand gesture. "You're always welcome here," he said. And that was it. That evening, Rowena packed her things. She moved slowly, folding clothes, slipping shoes back into her bag. Her fingers paused over the note she kept tucked in her jacket, the one Silas had left on the Eldorado's dashboard days ago. "People aren't so different." She stared at the words a moment longer before tucking it back. The motel room felt smaller than usual, the walls too close, the bed too neat. Outside, the town moved on, unaware. She loaded her bags into the Eldorado just as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows down Main Street. The engine thrummed beneath her hands, smooth, reliable, ready. She could leave right now. No one would stop her. But as she sat there, watching the soft glow of Mercer's auto in the distance, something inside her refused to settle. She turned, the engine off. The next morning, Rowena stood outside the garage before the sun had fully risen, the sky still streaked with lavender and gray. Silas stepped outside a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag, as if he already knew she'd be there. They stood quietly, the morning air cool between them. Finally, Rowena spoke, voice steady. "I was going to leave last night." Silas didn't flinch, just waited. She took a breath, lifting her gaze to meet his. "But then I realized," she said softly. "I don't want to." It felt like shedding armor she hadn't realized she'd been wearing. Silas nodded once, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No one's in a hurry here," he said gently. Rowena smiled back, something easing inside her for the first time in years. The late afternoon sun stretched long across Rockford's Main Street, casting golden slants of light through the garage bay doors. Inside Mercer's Auto, the steady hum of conversation mingled with the soft clatter of tools and the occasional burst of laughter. It had been nearly a year since Rowena first rolled into town in her Eldorado, the chrome gleaming, her eyes wary, her heart guarded. Now, the Eldorado sat once again parked at the front of the shop, polished and pristine, not just mechanically sound, but lovingly cared for. Rowena stood nearby, wiping her hands on a rag, watching as Clara proudly showed off how to replace a fan belt to a younger boy from down the block. Silas moved across the garage with his usual unhurried pace, organizing parts, nodding greetings as familiar faces popped in and out. Everything in its place, nothing rushed, just as it had always been. And yet, something about today felt different. A cool breeze drifted through the open doors, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. It was the day of the annual Rockford Classic Car Festival, and the town was abuzz with preparations. Banners fluttered between lampposts, local vendors setting up booths along the sidewalks. For Silas, the festival wasn't about trophies or showmanship. It was about stories, the history tucked into every vehicle, the fingerprints of those who'd cared for them. But this year, there was something else, too. A quiet undercurrent. Rowena had decided to enter her Eldorado in the showcase. She hadn't said much about it. No grand declarations, just a simple thought she deserved to be seen. Silas had only nodded, but there'd been a spark in his eyes. He understood. By late afternoon, the festival was in full swing. Main Street glowed beneath strings of lights, classic cars lined bumper to bumper, Chevys, Fords, Packards, all polished to perfection. Children weaved between the rows, laughter ringing out while families huddled near food stands, balancing plates piled high. Rowena stood beside her Eldorado, wiping down the hood one last time, her hands steady, her smile soft. She felt different now, not just because the car gleamed, but because she did. The conversations, the small-town chatter, the easy greetings from neighbors she now knew by name, it all felt like threads weaving into something solid beneath her feet. For years, she'd run on fast lanes and boardrooms, the hum of cities masking the ache beneath. But here, things moved slower, purposeful. Here, people looked you in the eye, not to measure, but to see. As evening settled, the awards ceremony began. Rowena didn't care much about prizes. She'd spent too many years watching people measure, worth in numbers, in accolades. That wasn't why she entered. Still, as they announced categories, Clara tugged at her sleeve, excitement shining bright in her eyes. "They're calling your class," she whispered. Rowena smiled, letting herself get swept up in the moment, even as the crowd gathered tighter. Then, over the hum of voices, the announcer's words rang out. Best Classic Restoration, 1960, Cadillac Eldorado. Owned by Rowena Blackwood. There was a beat of silence. Rowena blinked, stunned. Silas, standing a few paces behind, simply offered her that same calm nod, the corners of his mouth lifting. Clara grabbed Rowena's hand, practically bouncing. "You won! You really won!" But the trophy, small and unassuming, wasn't what stuck in Rowena's throat. It was the way the town cheered. Not because of who she was, but because she was theirs now. One of them. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the festival faded, Rowena found herself back at the garage. The doors were open, a soft breeze drifting in, carrying the quiet sounds of a town settling into sleep. Silas stood at the workbench, wiping down tools, the radio humming low in the background. Rowena leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching him. He looked up, offering a faint smile. "Didn't get a chance to congratulate you properly," he said. Rowena chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It's just a trophy." Silas wiped his hands, setting the rag aside. "Maybe. But some things are worth celebrating." There was something in his voice, something deeper, that made her chest tighten. She crossed the room slowly, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said, voice quieter now, "for everything." Silas met her eyes, that familiar steadiness anchoring her again. "You're the one who did the hard part," he said simply. Rowena swallowed, something unspoken, thick between them. "Maybe," she murmured. "But I wouldn't. Have figured it out alone." For a long moment they stood like that. No rush, no need to fill the silence. Finally, Silas glanced at the Eldorado parked outside, then back at her. "So," he asked casually, "you planning to stick around a while longer?" Rowena smiled, something sure and steady settling inside her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. Silas nodded, as if he'd known all along. Outside, the night air smelled like possibility. Rowena looked up at the stars stretching across. The sky, her heart full. Not of noise or pressure or the frantic pace she'd once known, but of something quieter, something rooted. She had found what she hadn't realized she was looking for. And this time, she wasn't driving away. It was the first true day of fall. The trees lining Main Street had begun their slow transformation, trading green for gold, russet, and crimson. Leaves tumbled lazily across the cracked sidewalks, the air crisp enough to smell faintly of wood smoke. Mercer's auto, the garage door, remained wide open, welcoming in the shifting season. The sounds inside were familiar. The soft murmur of Clara talking to customers, the clink of tools, the low hum of the radio playing some old tune from decades ago. But there was something else too, a subtle shift, a quiet fullness. Rowena stood at the back corner of the garage, sorting through a crate of spare parts, sleeves rolled up, grease smudged faintly across her wrist. She moved with an ease that had taken root slowly, like muscle, memory. The place felt as much hers now as it ever had anyone else's. She glanced up, watching Silas across the room. He was crouched near an old pickup, head bent, fingers moving deftly as he adjusted a stubborn bolt. For a moment, she simply watched him, the way the light filtered through the bay doors, catching silver strands in his hair, the quiet steadiness of him anchoring the whole space. It struck her then how much had changed, not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in small, ordinary ways. A year ago, she wouldn't have recognized herself. Now, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The town moved at its own pace that afternoon. Folks came and went, dropping off cars, stopping by to chat, offering fresh-baked pies or updates about their kids. The same rhythms, unhurried, steady. Rowena smiled softly as Clara darted past, waving, before hopping into the passenger seat of Mrs. Langley's station wagon to help her with groceries. Silas straightened from under the pickup, wiping his hands, and walked toward Rowena, his expression as calm and grounded as ever. "Thought I might take a drive later," he said, voice casual. "Take advantage of the weather." Rowena arched a brow, teasing. "You? Taking a break?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Figure it's about time." She laughed quietly, setting the crate aside. "Mind if I join?" Silas met her gaze, something warm flickering there. "You're always welcome." Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, they climbed into the Eldorado. the engine humming beneath them, a sound both familiar and comforting. They drove with the windows down, the wind tugging gently at Rowena's hair. The world outside rolled by in soft shades of gold and amber, the open road stretching before them like an invitation. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It felt natural, like something they both knew how to hold. Eventually, Rowena glanced over at Silas, her voice quiet. "You ever think about how funny it is? The way life turns." He looked at her, one hand steady on the wheel. "Funny how?" She smiled faintly. "How one broken car, one wrong turn, can change everything." Silas's eyes softened and he nodded. "Some things aren't accidents," he said simply. They drove a little farther, past fields just starting to fade for winter, past weathered barns and old fences leaning gently with age. Finally, they pulled over near a ridge that overlooked the town. From here, Rockford spread out below them. Quiet, familiar, every rooftop tinged gold by the sinking sun. They stood side by side, the wind cool against their faces, the world stretching wide around them. For a long moment, Rowena watched as the lights flickered on, one by one, across the town. The diner, the post office, the little bookstore at the corner. She breathed in deeply, feeling something settle inside her she hadn't even realized had still been restless. Silas spoke softly. Beside her, "I think people, like engines, just need the right hand sometimes." Rowena glanced at him, her heart tightening, not with sadness, but something quieter, something like peace. She smiled, the words slipping easily now. "Maybe it's not about fixing what's broken," she murmured. "Maybe it's about knowing when to stop running." Silas turned toward her, his eyes steady and sure. "Could be," he agreed. They stood like that for a while longer, the wind tugging at their sleeves, the town glowing quietly beneath them. That evening, back at the garage, Rowena helped Clara lock up. The lights dimmed, tools put away, doors closed. As she stepped outside, she paused, glancing back at the familiar space. The worn sign, the scent of oil and dust, the memories tucked into every corner. It wasn't perfect, but it was exactly enough. Silas joined her, his shoulder brushing lightly against hers. Neither of them spoke, because some endings don't need words. Some endings are really just beginnings. The next morning, life resumed its quiet rhythm. The town moved on, steady and sure. And somewhere in a little garage at the edge of Main Street, an engine hummed contentedly, and two hearts, both once restless, found a place they could finally call home. Well, now, that's the story. But before you head off, I gotta ask, where in the world are y'all tuning in from? Maybe you're sitting on a front porch somewhere with a sweet tea. Maybe you're watching from the city, wishing for a quiet small town like Rockford. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a comment down below, tell me where you're from, or share if you've ever known a kind soul like Silas Mercer in your life. And hey, if you like stories that warm your heart, maybe even restore your faith in folks a little, why not stick around? Hit that subscribe button and join us. Plenty more tales about good people, second chances, and maybe even the occasional Cadillac Eldorado coming your way. But most importantly, thanks for spending part of your day with me. Whether you stayed for the story, the cars, or just the company, I'm mighty glad you're here. Until next time, take care, be kind, and don't forget, sometimes the best things in life are hiding right around the corner. See y'all soon.